So that's the language that he's using. He's translated from, right? Okay, he's not using the modern Syriac. So, just trying to see if it's on this page again. Yeah. Okay, so he's using the Asher. Okay, so we basically verified according to those original ancient, very old manuscripts from the original second scribal language that Jesus the Christ existed. There's also videos of Dutch Uncle John and others where they look at the pictographs, the Hebrew words, the pictographs, etc., and they verify that, you know, Genesis 1 verse 1, etc., underneath like different layers, or different layer or something like that this Christ was, God was like the head of this tent, or the owner of this tent. He was the keeper of the tent and all this sort of stuff, you know. And it's basically saying that Christ is prophesied that Christ would at some point, say 4,000 years later, willingly put himself up on a cross as a sacrifice for the sins of all men. Okay, so that verifies there, supposedly both in the Hebrew and the Aramaic, that pictograph stage, that this Yeshua Mashiach, Jesus the Messiah, or Jesus the Christ, actually was. He actually existed. Okay? And he was revealed, manifested, he became God in the flesh, incarnated in the flesh. God on earth as a man. And spread the good news, etc., etc., through his disciples. So we're going to carry on with this.
I'll go into that this morning, as I have done it already. I'm just going to go on with the other verses regarding Adam. Brashit bara Allah yad Shmaya yad Ara. Shmaya is heaven and Ara is earth. Because there was nothing at the beginning, there was no time or space. So he created everything, time and space. And now I'm going to go and read from the book of creation, the story of how Adam and Eve were created, how he...
Okay, so he does that, and what we're going to do is we're going to jump. This is very important that we'll see this. I know we've covered it in other videos.
Which is Yeshua Mashiach, Jesus the Messiah. It's the symbol of Allah Ashur, which is the symbol of God or the Godhood. Ashur with the sun, the wings of the Holy Spirit, and the Father in the bosom of the Father. So it's Ashur.
See, so he's explaining this. This verifies the ancient triune. Yeah. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody's gone deep into it. We will do that probably in the next video. Okay, what it actually means. We understand and believe that this originally was like Sumerian, Akkadian, etc. Right, but this picture here was changed because the old Assyrian version of this, and it's just a completely different thing, was a king called Asher with an arrow. It's probably pointing the other way with this arrow, and it looks like it's been adopted and adapted. Right, it's changed. It has this different figure without the arrow, etc. Right, but he has a crown of righteousness, etc., etc. So this is the triune, which is different from the Christian understanding concept of the Trinity, supposedly put together by the Roman Tertullian. You go do your personal research on that, because a Christian said to us, no, that's all rubbish, didn't come from him, the guy hadn't done his homework. Right, we have, so we can do that to prove that. Right, okay, that concept came from a Roman, and it's completely different, as is Elohim. Okay, Elohim has a different ending from the Hebrew Elohim. Elohim, and they have there's two different meanings. Possibly in the Hebrew, Elohim means the one, or the one God, something like that. We're not proficient in Hebrew, but we could look online or ask a practicing Jew what does it actually mean. But they are two different concepts, right? They have two different meanings. Even though the original ancient, very old Aramaic or Asherit was a sister language of the original ancient, very old Tav Asherit, Tav Ivri or Avri, or the original ancient, very old Hebrew. They had same words, same meanings, until a point where it was probably modified, maybe by the Masoretes or through the Masoretes. So now you have the same words but with different meanings. Okay? Like, for example, you have Yuma, which is, when translated in English, it was a miserable period or unfathomable period, era, eon, age, or day with a capital D, to do with the creation of the two suns, or the sun and the moon, and the lunar solar cycle. And the Yom, the word Yom, which is Hebrew, which is day with a little d, which probably with them means a literal day of the week, 12 hours of daylight, 12 hours of night, right? And that all creation was done in 6 literal days, and God rested on the 7th. Churches teach that as well. Okay, so this is very, very old. It has a very different meaning. It's also referred to as over the flames. Elohim over the flames. We'll do a video on that, as we promised, at some point.
It's the symbol of the Son, which is Yeshua Mashiach, Jesus the Messiah, prophesied thousands of years before the scriptures were written. So I use the symbol because this is not a pagan god, as some people seem to think. And I even saw a program on television that said that, something about Anunnaki coming from outer space and all this sort of thing. These programs I saw on the History Channel.
Yeah, that's George Snuffleupagus, or whatever his name is, Thalopoulos, whatever. He really gets into all that sort of stuff. Apparently, we found out with Victor Ian Alexander's website, we found on there that he said about Zechariah Sitchin and this other guy, what's his name? Did the chariots of the gods. Van Daniken, they made stuff up to fit the evolution concept, right? Etc., etc. So be aware of those two.
Talk about aliens coming to Earth and all these symbols of the Trinity, of Allah, God, and all the sort of the creation, everything is explained in terms of aliens conducting genetic splicing and creating the human race, etc., etc.
So yeah, as we said earlier, we would use logic and common sense, knowing that someone or something created us, right, brought us into existence. We really believe in this Brita, Genesis, creation, text, etc., right? We're just using logic and common sense that, again, that we were created, as human beings were created and brought into existence, right? Or there's the alternative, if this all proves wrong, there's that alternative that these extraterrestrial confederation, conglomeration did all this genetic splicing, hybridization, etc., because they needed to save their dying planet, or this sort of Zechariah Sitchin stuff, if it proves to be 100% established fact, true, and so forth. Okay, so we think that's probably enough ones.
This is pictographic language. This is not paganism. So, if the translation of the scriptures was merely taking an electronic file of one of the Bible translations and simply substituting certain words here and there and correcting some mistakes in grammar or in the word meanings or something like that, I would have finished the whole Bible by now. I would have published the whole scriptures. but my purpose is not just to make money.
Yeah, as we said, he didn't complete it because he had some issues, health issues, etc. But he did do a complete New Testament. So we try to bring you as much as we can of both his translation of the OT, or Old Testament, and the New Testament. So back to our notes. We can have a little look at this. Who are the Ashuri? Preface. Who writes the history of a nation such as the Ashuri 26 centuries after the biblically famous capital Nineveh was abandoned to the enemy? That's where Jonah went, right? To these Ashuri. The American missionaries who established the first medical missionary college, the Kala in Urmia, Iran, were mostly impressed by the Ashuri people's retention of their Christian faith in a sea of Islamic nations surrounding them, but predictably not concerned with their ancient roots. They learned of the surviving Christian nation only in the late 19th century, after archaeological discoveries of biblical cities in North Mesopotamia. They were amazed that the Ashuri had established the greatest church during the 12th century, incidentally surviving to this day as the Church of the East. They learned that according to the Ashuri people themselves, the name of the nation Ashur, or Ashur in Greek, because they don't have the SH sound in their language, was not important in the sight of God. From the apostolic age onwards, the Ashuri had come to call themselves only Christians, and since their Christianity had emanated from Syria through the work of such apostles as the Saint Adai, they most commonly referred to themselves as Syriai, which means of the Syrian persuasion or Christian. There's a footnote there on that. Theodorus Mar Shimun, or Isa Shimun, the brother of the late patriarch Mar Shimun 23, is a source for this explanation of the name commonly used by the modern day Ashuri in referring to themselves. Okay, they say that they're not Assyrians, they're Ashuri. Apparently there's a difference between it. Some might say they are. Yeah, you have to take that with an Assyrian. Pronounced Ashuri. Assyrian is the Anglicized version, that's the Anglicized version of the name Ashuri. It is theorized by Ashuri scholars that the Greeks, who were the first to write of Ashur, or Ashur, do not have the letter Sheen, the sound of the letter Sh, and therefore came up with the spelling Ashur for Ashur. Ashur for Ashur. So that's why they had the name of the country was Assyria. Okay, and on the end of it is a N suffix, which is a loan word of the Greek and the Latin, which means that this region belonged or was possessed by a certain people. Neither does the English language have the letter Sheen for the sound of Sh. However, unlike Greek, the sound of the Aramaic, a Western designation for the ancient language of the Ashuri, the phonetic Sh is commonly used in English, for example, in the word shame. But when it came to constructing a name for the Ashuri nation in the English language, Assyrians was used. Victor Alexander personally believes that it was a malicious designation and unsportsmanlike of the English to kick someone who had fallen down. No major nation has changed its very name to reflect its religion. When the Ashuri people discovered that Jesus Christ was the living God personified, it's coming from the horse's mouth, from these Ashuri people who had discovered that Jesus Christ was the living God personified, they stopped calling themselves Ashuri and adopted the name Christians. Meshikai, of the Anointed One in the Ashuri language, or more commonly Suri, right? Suriai, very hard, I don't know Aramaic, as Victor Alexander has indicated. So it's a different type of Christian, because these disciples, etc., under the Romans, pagans, they don't want to be called Christians in their concept of it, because it's a borrowed word, loan word from the Greeks, right, which means slaves to Christos, or basically slaves. They don't want anything to do with any pagans. Yeah, had bull sacrifices, did this, did that, right? So they used the term Meshikai, of the Anointed One, or followers of the Messiah, right? In the Ashuri language, or more commonly Suriai, as he's indicated. The Asherai then went further and literally retired the word master and its derivatives, Mr, Mrs and Miss, from the language in honour of the Lord Jesus Christ and the Virgin Mary, Maran Yahshua Mashiach, which means our Master Jesus Christ, and Mariam, which means our Mistress Mary, etc., etc. As a result, the Asherai identity as a nation has become suspect for too long. The designation for this once world empire, Asher, has been out of use 26 centuries. In fact, that today's nations hardly remember that such a people ever existed. And as for the continuity of ancient lineage, there's even more skepticism. The new interest in Christianity, especially from the TV evangelists and the born-again movement, has ironically been responsible for the shedding of new light on the Assyrians as a sort of biblical people. Granted that it is for the most part negative in reference, note the often mentioned cruelty of the Assyrians in dealing with the ancient world during these broadcasts. This reference to the Assyrians is only in context of an ancient people who are no longer extant among world cultures. And Westerners, the major universities and churches, do not accept the Asherai as a surviving nation. Not even the British allies of the First and Second World Wars, who had enlisted the participation of the Asherai as an ally. The Asherai were referred to as the smallest ally, and had the grace of mentioning the Asherai as a surviving nation in their modern historical books. To this day, none of the Allies officially recognise the Asherai contribution to the Allied cause during the two World Wars. Why is that so? If it was a simple answer, Victor Alexander would not be writing this book, or this translation. And if the question could be answered by one book, he would have written this one 17 years ago, when he started doing research and realised the discrepancy in the Allied nations' histories. Because they are promised their land back. That was stolen from them, apparently, by these British, and the British reneged. They did the dirty on them and didn't follow through. Okay, guys, what about the Israeli or American Jewish scholars? Why wouldn't they write of their survival? Didn't the Asherai and the Jewish people speak and write in an identical language called Aramaic at the time of Jesus Christ? Wouldn't that fall within the world of scholarship to write the Asherai history as a companion to their own history? Yeah, they don't make any mention of it. They say, oh, we use this script here as the Asherit, or this sort of stuff, right? We're using or speaking the Asherit when they're not. Yeah, then they say, oh, we've got a modern Israeli Hebrew, or it's the old Phoenician that we're using, comes from there, or this sort of stuff, right? They don't acknowledge the Asherai. Okay? There's no mention of it. How can we expect anyone to accept their survival as a nation from antiquity if none of the scholars or learned people bother to write about it? Their people, right? Of course, there have been books written on the subject of modern day Asherai and their affairs, but no one has dealt satisfactorily with the actual survival of the Asherai. No one has produced acceptable scholarship in this regard for the Western world to include within their universities and official libraries. No one argues about the Jews. Yes? No one denies the Jews did survive. But did the Greeks? Greeks are still called Greeks today. However, are they like the Greeks of the times of Aristotle though? Did the Romans survive? Did the Egyptians of the Pharaohs? Did the Vikings? These are questions with problematic answers. Who decides if the integrity of a culture survives? Who decides which nation has retained its cultural characteristics sufficiently that it can be said to have survived from its ancient roots and therefore may retain its original name? Ironically, in the case of the Asherai, there is a magnificent branch of archaeology called Assyriology, a branch totally devoted to the study of the Asherai as an extinct civilization of Mesopotamia. The Chicago University Department of Oriental Studies has published a multi-volume book called the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, commonly referred to as CAD by the scholars of Assyriology, which encompasses the entire subject of Ashur, Babylon, Sumer, and other major cities of ancient Mesopotamia. Yeah, Stephanie Daly, another guy called Thorenson, and quite a few others. Many of today's Asherai naively draw strength from this designation of a unifying scope, namely that CAD implies that Asher is still extant in the context of the survival of its common language, a language which is still spoken in many modern dialects such as Syriac, just a modern dialect, or Assyrian as it is commonly called by American Asherai, Chaldean, Syrian, Jacobite, Maronite, Aramite, a Jewish minority in North Iran, and others. Victor Alexander states here, that he was aware that he was writing about a vast subject, but he felt the urgency to write something because nobody is writing or had written on the subject of the survival of the Asherai with regard to the survival of the essence of the Asherai character and civilization. Therefore, he wrote for the preservation of what his circle of the Asherai share in common knowledge, for the edification of his generation and for his friends, regardless of their nationality, religion, or place of origin. His deepest impulse was to promote goodwill and understanding for the Asherai survival cause among the nations of the Middle East and the rest of the world, and especially being an American, because he moved to America, he would like to share the knowledge of the Asherai civilization with his American friends. Even though what he had to say might seem strange at times, his biggest hope for the future of the Asherai is a sense of unity, which will ultimately be the only road to recognition of their survival as a people of antiquity. Indeed, the people who define the meaning of the word civilization. Without rediscovering the Asherai civilization from its roots and following the continuity of humankind's development throughout the ages, in the context of those roots, the very concept of civilization will become obsolete in time, because no concept, even the concept of civilization, can survive forever without the omission of its roots. He also wrote knowing that this work would be perceived by most scholars as being grossly inaccurate. Yet we can bring you some comments from a person with 2 doctorates in the Aramaic and Hebrew who seems to drop hints of that, saying that there's no original manuscripts, full copies of it, where Victor Alexander actually states the Church of the East hid them for 2,000 years, therefore preserving them. He puts here, because no concept, even the concept of civilization, can survive forever without the omission of its roots. Again, he also wrote knowing that this work will be perceived by most scholars as being grossly inaccurate if you allow him to use a charitable word towards his own effort. Accuracy depends on repeated perceptions of history, in this case, of a culture from an unbiased perspective. When a nation is homeless, then there are few scholars who will take up their pen to write an unbiased account of the history, even of their survival. So that verifies, as we keep telling people, he didn't add his own bias, prejudice, twist it, add his own flavour, etc. to the scriptures. Okay, he made it his mission to translate into the nearest English equivalent wherever possible. Sometimes the ancient Aramaic doesn't have a word equivalent, right, to the English. So again, he has to go around and find it in translating, so people understand what it's trying to say, right? Yeah, and there's people that just say, oh, he's like every other translator, he's biased, got prejudice, all that sort of stuff. No. It's his own words there from the horse's mouth. Okay, that he didn't want to do that, he didn't want to add that, right? So he didn't use the modern Bible versions as a translation or something to translate from, because of didn't want that embedded in his subconscious or this sort of stuff. We can cover that, what he said about that also. So we've studied what his former website, right, that's downed, but we found a way to restrict it, so we know what we're talking about. If he thinks, no, you're giving the wrong information, or we're hoping that he'll come in and point it out to us, right? But we're basically going by what he's saying here, what he said on his website, va.com, right? He says, when a nation is homeless, then there are few scholars who will take up their pen to write an unbiased account. So that's what he's doing. He's writing. He translated an unbiased account of their history, their text, everything, even of their survival. Nevertheless, he does have complete faith in the knowledge that he is presenting the truth, because he believed Western scholarship is terribly biased. Okay, so that's where it's biased. In the recording of history in the absence of a profit incentive. If it ain't going to make you money, okay. And he felt that it was his obligation as a minority writer to present an Asherite point of view. And he wishes to thank certain people who made possible the publication of this translation of this book. It's the first civilization, named the first civilization. Okay. He's saying thanks to the Syrian American National Federation Incorporated, etc. He's very appreciative of the American people, through whose achievement and freedom and democracy it is possible for an individual to gather the knowledge freely available at American libraries and present it in printed form for the public to read. Yeah, it's in the public domain, public access, it's available, etc. He thanks Jesus Christ for keeping him under his merciful guidance all his life, without whom he is nothing. Yeah. So he strongly believes in Yeshua Mashiach. Okay. So we are going to jump to another man. Actually, we're going to go right back here. Okay. To this man here. Dr. James D. Francisco. He's got 2 PH.ds or doctorates in the Aramaic and the Hebrew, the Syriac and the modern Syriac and the modern Hebrew, which is different from Victor Alexander, native-born Aramaic-speaking translator, who has gone back right through this method he used to revive this old dead language, right? So he can translate those manuscripts into English. Okay, so there's quite a few comments here. Okay, we added our 50 cents worth. We've asked this guy, because he's an expert, right? So we're asking him questions. Okay, we're not asking someone in a garage, run-down garage at the back of their house with a certificate from some school, right? Or they bought it online. Okay, so we've asked them questions like, because someone said the book of Isaiah was entirely written in Hebrew, not Aramaic. Maybe they're of the Judaic faith. So we asked them, was the book of Isaiah entirely written in Aramaic? Was told it never was, even though Google search has many websites saying it was, and the ancient Aramaic Isaiah has been translated from the Aramaic into English. So he kindly replied, the book of Isaiah was written in Hebrew. There's an Aramaic version called the Peshitta. This has been translated into English by Lamsa in the Antioch Bible series. There's also an Aramaic translation in Targum Jonathan. Okay, so we've previously asked him about Victor Alexander, right? Yeah, so we're saying thank you for that, because it's good information, right? For us. There's also Victor Ian Alexander's translation of it in full from the supposed original ancient very old Galilean Aramaic. I showed what I believe to be a Judaic or Hebrew onlyist and others like that, but they were insisting that I was wrong, dreaming as far as not mentioning Jesus in any of the OT texts at all. They often comment me or ask there was no prophecies of him in Psalms, Daniel, etc. because Rabbi Tobias Singer, etc. say there isn't, so they say there isn't. Must be true, right? And also, as we mentioned before, Google has numerous websites where experts like himself and non-experts say that the book of Isaiah was written in Aramaic, not Hebrew. It as you say, it was maybe a copy that was written in Aramaic. And Victor N. Alexander says on his now downed website that he was asked by a high priest of the Church of the East why he was translating the NT using the Syriac Eastern Peshitta, which was written in Greek, then translated into the Aramaic, from there at some point, then into the English. So he bought a copy of those original ancient, very old, hidden, therefore preserved manuscripts, of which he reads from on his YouTube video, Adam and Eve, the Aramaic scriptures, which we just covered. Okay, this one here. Okay, so mistake here should be Adam and Eve. Jeez, give the guy a break. Bit of humour there. Okay, here it is here. We ask him, what is the proof that Jesus existed outside of the Bible? That no one can deny as established fact, evidence that proves itself beyond any doubt that he existed. And would you make the disciples to be regarded as irrefutable? Or would it make the disciples then to be regarded as irrefutable and their writings text infallible? Because we're doing this video, right? To verify that he actually existed. Okay, so he replies, they're posted quite a bit here. There's a lot of garbage on the internet and much fantasy about Aramaic and religion in general. Outside the Bible, There's only a small section of Josephus written during the 1st century regarding Jesus, but he is not alone because there's little written about anyone outside of the writings of their own group. Isaiah doesn't mention Jesus. Isaianic texts are used as Pesharim. Okay, something to do with Hebrew, right? Obviously that's in Hebrew. In the Gospels, the first 2 chapters of Matthew and Luke were probably later additions to a more pristine Gospel or better version of it. Each book of the Bible is separate and may have been written in different languages, Hebrew, Aramaic or Greek. To dogmatically argue whether Greek or Aramaic Syriac was first is futile. Okay, so he replied to that in regard to his answers to us. There's a lot of garbage on the internet and much fantasy about Aramaic and religion in general. Extremely true. Outside of the Bible, there's only a small section of Josephus written during the 1st century regarding Jesus. True. And he became the adopted son of Flavius, right? And wrote in such a way to please his new Roman family, yeah? Victor N. Alexander has translated the entire book of Isaiah, and there's a prophecy he details in his footnote that Yeshua Mashiach is mentioned in the first verse, Isaiah 45:1. Allah or God speaking to his Messiah, the anointed one, or his anointed one. Not Cyrus the king, but his anointed one, Yeshua, Yeshu, right? The book of Isaiah prophesies about the coming of Yeshua or Jesus the Messiah. The book of Isaiah is also a book of revelation, the revelation of Yeshua, Jesus. So it was revealing him, right? Okay, because all men knew of God, but they never seen God. They couldn't look upon the face of God and hope to live, etc., etc. Moses was afraid to look at God face to face. John in Revelations only saw his legs, arms, clothing, right? Jeremiah only saw him passing by, and he only saw his back or something like that, and so forth, right? So it's all there in the Old Testament. Okay, it's just people don't have that original ancient sacred scribe or old tongue. Nishana Artika, Supriya, of the Kitab Esher, translated into English. They've got all these modern versions where they study become adept in the modern Syriac, Hebrew or Greek, or Latinized form of Greek. Yeah. So here's what Isaiah 45:1 says in Victor N. Alexander's translation of Isaiah 1. Thus said the Maya to his Messiah, to Koresh, whom I took by my right hand. Here's the footnote here. 45:1. Literal Aramaic retained the Lord. The Lord. Reference is to Yeshua, the Messiah, or Jesus, the Messiah, and the Father. So it's the Father talking to his anointed one, i.e. his Son. To Koresh, footnote indication here, or to Koresh. To Koresh, whom I took by my right hand. 45:1-2. Literal Aramaic idiom, Meshike, or his anointed one. Meshike, or his anointed. Cyrus is not the Messiah. It is the Messiah who speaks through this prophecy. Okay. 45:1-3. Literal Aramaic idiom, or expression. Cyrus, king of Persia, was used as a servant of the Lord who carried out the conquest of the Holy Lands before Yeshua, the Messiah, would come to earth. Okay, the temple was destroyed. They went into Babylonian exile. They couldn't do their religion. Remember the song, Rivers of Babylon? We remember the rivers of Babylon, where we wept, where we remember Sion. Okay, Israel, right, and the temple, etc. Right. So it was a way through God, through Cyrus, to let his people within his kingdom practice their religion, and then they could eventually go back to Jerusalem and repair that temple, or rebuild the temple, right? Not all of them went back.